So in the Tao, because we all are familiar with the yin yang symbol, I think it's actually, and this would be my opinion, I guess, my bias. Uh, I'm talking about essential Tao insight, the insight of what's called Taoism, which comes from or comes out of the mind of someone purported to be named Lao Tzu. Whatever the case may be, a lot of these insights that come by way of the Tao, to me, are some of the most pure, truthful, essential, uh, unobscured, clear, um, insights and anecdotes on existence and non-existence. But of course, you would have to have, I would say, the more correct context, I would say, before you would be able to penetrate what's actually being taught. Because it's very popular. I get people who come to my channel who are into the Tao. Um, so, this is for a lot of those people also who delve into those mysteries. And also for the normal human conscious person who loves the yin yang symbol and believes that life is such a balance of light, dark, black, white, evil, good, and that's what the yin yang represents. Well, this will go a little further, expound upon exactly what they were pointing to. So, this is from a book here discussing Taoism. It says, the first step towards understanding the nature of the ultimate goal is to understand death, which has been termed life's only certainty. So here he's telling you the first step before you do anything, like I said, the correct context, you need to understand, or I would say contemplate or appreciate the fact of not life, non-life, psychophysical existence not being a main factor, a norm. Because the Tao, you're talking about something, what do they say? Nameless, intangible, invisible. But again, some people would just say, well, the Tao is just the energy of life, the animating forces, and that's a part of it, but that would be a degradation of the essential teaching, because you're talking about something nameless, formless. It can't be appropriated, but I guess you can say it can't sustain. And that is what it does, and that is the part that most people would appreciate when they talk about the Tao. They talk about going along with the flow of life. The flow. Because it's based on, of course, their delusional optimism, which of course will prevent them from understanding the true Tao. Because like he says here, well, first you need to understand, or as I said, appreciate or regard the fact of death. The fact of, again, non-being being the norm, and what you call life being an exception, an anomaly, sort of an aberration. Because whatever can be said by the dualist, you know and I know, this you that is going through these experiences down here, these 5 sense flesh and blood experiences that are very real for all intents and purposes. This experience was born, and it will surely die, and with it the memory connected and even utilized by it. In this scenario, this is a terminal scenario. It's almost abortive in a sense. You just have to admit that, well, that means it's futile. Well, that's what it means. I mean, it's the empirical fact. I mean, it's not something you could really, your emotional reaction's not going to change the facts. For all intents and purposes, the mind and body will go. So regardless of all the fantasies that the dualist can construct, we're still left with a something that came and went again. That would be what you call life, which would be something again that can only be characterized as terminal, yet and still an aberration, an anomaly. It's the exception. Non-being would be the rule. So being would actually be the exception. The norm, the standard would be what is called the absolute. But what I'm explaining here is what they mean by absolute and non-dual is actually non-being, which is again pre-creation before this deficiency appeared. But the Tao would have to be something immutable. And that is what is being cultivated when you talk about alchemy. You're cultivating the Tao, which is something that was before or transcends the material and the mental, even. So it's birthless, it's deathless, therefore it is immortal. It's not immortal, or it can't make you immortal. This you that was born must die because you were born. So you must come, you must go. You can't, break that law. You can extend it all you want, but that's the law. And from what I see, is pretty much unbreakable. I see some attempts from modern science, of course, but regardless of the fact, this civilization will probably fall before you could even get close to extending this life, physically or chemically, I would say beyond, 250. When we also know there was one guy who lived to 250 just based off of embryonic breathing, in turtle breathing, they call it. Very deep practice. He was about 220, I think. But regardless, 2 centuries, 1 century, 3/4 of a century. If you use a measuring stick and place that against infinity, basically, it's swallowed. And it's virtually nothing. So much so that I might as well regard it as non-existent. So in this context, non-existent would mean illusion. It means this so-called reality would actually be something that I can regard as not real, measured against what's called the absolute non-dual, which is timeless, spaceless. Therefore, that pretty much swallows up something that would be seen as a blink of an eye. And this vision or this understanding in consciousness is what starts to enlighten the consciousness. Again, this can put you above life. It actually, you really can appreciate taking a lofty view of this scenario called life. You can be anchored in a deeper understanding. People are so confused, and a lot of their confusion has to do with this misunderstanding of the what I call the great matter. So the Tao cultivates the great matter, or at least what it does cultivate, it reveals the great matter and decidedly knows which way to go, which is toward the Tao. So the Tao is immortal. By cultivating that immortal energy, you become one with that, this elusive you. Now, your psychophysical organism, and again, I use that word loosely, it's semantics, or this psychophysical organism that you are concomitant with, this cannot be made immortal. This mind with its monotonous thoughts, this body with its monotonous habits and needs, why would you even want to make it immortal? That would be foolish after about, what? Come on, 250 years, really, it just depends on your consciousness. And it depends on your perception of life. But at some point, you would grow tired of the monotony. And you would desire for the, at least transformation, complete overhaul of the mind-body, just for variety. So that goes into the whole heaven would actually be boring. And most people down here, in this plane, you wouldn't dare. You would be bored to tears with heaven. So the concept of immortality has been distorted, and people have superimposed it onto the psychophysical organism as creatures will do. And that's no surprise. It's just the esoteric reality, you know, is always going to be, I don't want to say hidden, but it's always going to be obscured by that phenomenon. Because, we have to expect that's naturally going to be the case. Doctrines always degrade, but to superimpose that onto what they would call the transformations is foolish. You can't have immortal transformations. So this would be considered the transformations of impure chi based on the Tao and the Taoist formula. You have pure chi, impure chi. Conception, birth, our aging, disease, decay, and that's in the ideal lifespan. I say that in quotes, ideal, because of course a lot of people, what, what's the name of that show? 1,000 Ways to Die. I mean, there's, you know, pick one. But this whole process is considered transformations of chi. Again, I would consider this impure chi. So what you have is in the yin yang, you have the greater portions of the black and white would be actually the night and day, let's say, of creation, cyclical, but carrying in those tiny dots, those inverse dots, those contrasting dots, it carries the primordial pure chi within its cycles. That's actually the original interpretation or the meaning or intent of that symbol. They were saying that something is caught in these cycles. That something, of course, becomes you as an individual when it gets into theology and religion. That's where you get metempsychosis, known as reincarnation, rebirth, which over 80% of so-called spiritual or conscious or metaphysical teachers or learners adhere to. But originally there was no individuality given to that. And by that I mean those two primordial dots you see inside the yin yang. Their whole understanding was that, again, this must be sort of a parasite. And so what you're actually doing is you're superimposing this, you're falsely or wrongly superimposing this immortal chi onto the mortal. Because that greater portion of the yin yang would actually be, the parasite, the mortal, the constant transformations of the impure chi. So when you have pure chi, you have what is called, the state of, you have the unborn. If it's unborn, it can't die, which means it's already immortal. You can't become immortal. That doesn't make sense. If you try to make sense of it, you can't, because, like I said, that doesn't make sense. So another quote, it says, the erroneous idea that immortality literally means never to die. Rather, it means that one returns to one's origins in Tao and spiritually coexists with heaven and earth. Now, heaven and earth, this is flat earth understanding. The heavens would be the firmament. We know the sun, moon, stars, same cliche. And whatever is above, the airy ethers or whatever. And then also you have earth. We know earth is the surface, specifically, I guess, the mud and the vegetation. And then, of course, the water. Now, to spiritually coexist, of course, would mean that you actually are reconnected to the energy that permeates existence. But not only that, you're reconnected to the origin, the original energy that is hosting the energy that forms creation. That's the esoteric point of view when you look at those, again, those two inner dots. So then they go on to say you then reach a state where physical death has become negligible. So that's the point. When they become immortal, no, you're not going to live forever. Like, that's not even possible. As I said, that not even is it not possible, to want to already shows that you're not really a serious thinker, or let alone enlightened, because enlightened has a lot to do with the gnosis and also the enlightened pessimism. That has a lot to do with enlightenment, which a lot of people don't even like. So they can't be enlightened. You can't be above life. There can be no light over your head, or no light because you're still in the dark. You're still not clear. You don't have, this it's the inner light they talk about. So that's always been, it's dark light. It's the darkness, really. So it's not physically, or to the eyeball, it's not that type of light. But things become much clearer, and of course, therefore, when the psychophysical organism is ceasing or ready to cease, in that sense, it becomes negligible. It's not a big deal because you understand, again, that whole principle, not self, and the original Tao would not correspond to that state, which is the transformations, which can never actually be. So again, you can't try to superimpose immortality on the constant transformations. That is their account of what you find in Buddhism of dependent origination. It's pretty much the same thing when you talk about accepting the transformations. Now, some of those doctrines may be viewed in light of sunlight and mountains, and but they're talking about birth and death, and they're talking about understand that birth equals death. And Lao Tzu talks about how that would equalize, or that would pacify the intellect, so to erase the fear of death. Again, this has a lot to do with if you're conscious, you don't have any fear of non-existence. I'm not talking about you should have no aversion toward injury or harm or physical trauma. No, that is fucking crazy. I'm saying you should have no aversion to non-existence, which is the root of a lot of the fear. It's not simply injury. So the transformation of consciousness, that automatically happens when you cultivate the Tao, of course, because once that permeates the conscious energy, you're pretty much, you just know. There's no words for it. You just know the situation. You understand, and you have no fear of the great fear that everyone shares in common, all the terrestrial creatures. Now, initially, it's not an acceptance of it as an acquiescence to this process. It's actually a devaluation of these of the transformations of dirty chi by seeing them for what they are. These constant transformations of basically construction, destruction, and it points to futility in that sense. And that is where you would get the dualist, because based on optimism, you would need dualism because the futility would be all too obvious. So you would have to invent. Now, of course, we have now, and a lot of people, I think, I'm not about to say 50%, but it's a high number of what you would call atheists. A lot of atheists, they pretty much have the conviction and know that, well, death is just death. It is what it shows itself to be. But they don't have the metaphysical side, the metaphysical understanding, or are even familiar with this process. Whereas if I present this, or if you present this information, the Tao and the cultivation, to them it's mystical fantasy. This immutable, immortal. It sounds like childish wishing to the mechanical mind, and that's actually good. That keeps them out. They talk about that. The inferior people laugh at it. The superior people get right to it, or at least they have a craving to just know and admire it. At least, as they say, with the mediocre. But it is real. But these transformations, again, are not held in high regard. So, again, it says, thus, neither a naive belief about Taoism's high regard for the body, nor an assumed dualism between body and spirit is justified. So he's basically telling you, and I'll put the links to this book here. He's saying, no, that assumption is not even in Taoism. And again, as I said, it's the purest doctrine. It's most absent of complex theology and, like I said, screenwriting, which is inspirational and serves a purpose for, the personal mind, the personal emotional structure. We have these emotional needs, and we're pretty much ignorant of these great matters. So you could be coaxed into it But then there are some minds that are terse. But that is why religions and things are so powerful and popular, because they hit people at a psychophysical, emotional, that level that is so, inspirational. It gets inside, it ignites the passions, but it hypnotizes for sure. And it's powerful. The hypnotism is just powerful. But again, the high regard for the body is not justified. They don't look at like you see these chakra pictures of a body with these colored wheels, chakras, and lights, and the light crown, and even the this vibrant, luminescent, illuminated corpse. That one artist, he depicts these skinless bodies, and he tries to glorify it. I guess it's some trippy shit he got off an acid or DMT trip. But yeah, they don't regard that with high respect. The transformations of dirty chi, nor do they assume that the mind will leave the body and go into another body or another dimension. That is not any essential Taoism. They're not big on doctrines and theologies. They're big on insight, reflection, practice. That's it. They're the most terse of the seekers, or just those for want of understanding. So again, they don't even look in, to this whole this metempsychosis, transmigration of a personal mind. All of that is fantastical fancy, based on the theory that the subtle body will exist or even pre-exist the mortal coil. And that's a theory, that's an assumption. It's not really validated. I'm sure you don't remember any dreams or anything before you were born, and everyone. I guess we were Men in Black zapped at birth and we forgot. You can make the case, but again, or you could just say you don't remember it because you weren't conscious. Because again, this perceiver, that again, this elusive you, without this psychophysical organism, do you really truly believe that there exists this similar mind and mindset? And it would have no correlation to any other dimension, so it wouldn't even make sense. And again, that goes into dependent origination. You're not you based off of you being you. You can only be you based off this environment. They bounce off each other. It's like an infinite loop. So no, they don't regard this dualism, this fantastical dualism, as legit, and that's not the point. Again, the point, like you said, the ultimate goal is to just understand what we call death. Again, that's a misnomer in most cases, but I would just say non-being, and that's what they cultivate. That's what they call the Tao. That's what they regard as high, supreme, everlasting, before and after. Because this basically is seen as, like I said, it's disposable. It's in the Tao Te Ching. He says, it says, heaven and earth treats everything like sacrificial dogs. Yeah, they're like a sacrifice. I mean, it's a little blunt, but if you really look at it, I mean, that's what's really going on. This place is pretty much, like they say, it's a mortal pit. It's the land of the dead, and this is again why they cultivate the Tao. And this is what they will call. Okay, well, as long as, let's say, the psychophysical organism does exist, then they can actually be alive in consciousness, always awake, always awakened. And again, awakened to the great matter, which disturbs and confuses a lot of people. Just not understanding what you call death, not contemplating that enough. That alone, like I said, that's the great guru. That'll enwisen you to a high degree. Then you'll be able to see how absurd life is, and that will put you above it, per se, meaning it's actually easier to maneuver through it. But again, the Tao, the yin yang, it's esoteric. It's all about gnosis. It's all about something that is worthwhile, and it's anti-futility. And of course, once you drop the dualism, what you have to mature consideration is futility. And so, since the ancients, as they call them, they share this way, as they say, of reconnecting to something that's let's just say is not futility, then they had that understanding to fall back on. And that's another problem with this understanding, is because people don't have anything to fall back on. So the first thing, people come to me is, oh, just kill yourself. You talk about suicide. It's like that. You're showing that you're still confused about this great matter. You should have thought about that when you seen that, that baby emerge into the world. It's already subject to destruction. So whether it's the bus, whether it's the cancer cell, the flu, the bullet, the blade, the surface, the liquids, the gases, there was always going to be a final push to shut off the mortal coil. Its nature is destruction. So, suicide in that context would really just be a cut to the chase. And in some sects, they do view natural death as they disparage natural death because, again, like I said, this body, this organism is predominantly ownerless. You can puppeteer it to a degree, the psychophysical aspects, like we do. We point our minds in directions, we point our bodies in directions, but you don't own it fully. You're not in complete control of it. So the involuntary death to a lot of sects, a lot of those guys say, well, that's actually part of your bestial nature. You're still bewildered. You know what this thing is going to do. So why are you so confused about it? That goes into the delusion. That's why they say guys with the Tao, it's just welcomed. It's negligible. It's not even an issue. It's allowed to happen. And in that state, of course, they have the advantage of being in that state where it's like a pinch. So again, the cultivation of the Tao, all this comes down to is fullness versus deficiency, and what is valuable and what has very little value to serious consideration. But it's backed up and verified by this practice, what people call enlightenment. I'm just letting you know what enlightenment really is. And it's not, of course, what you're going to be told if you type in enlightenment on YouTube. There's an element to it, and there's a reason why most people won't even get there, let alone have the mentality that points there, because your mentality can do a lot as far as transforming those subconscious beliefs. It would actually transform those, which would help you perceive in a much, let's say, different way, or even more clearly. So it does work in that sense, but again, you have to have that understanding. So enlightenment, cultivating the Tao, the third eye, all these things are one and the same, whether you call it Kundalini, Chi. It all comes back to this primordial, this Tao, this immutable, pre, post, trans, creative, destructive energy. Peace.